Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Darcy, and in today's talk, I'm going to be discussing the female reproductive system. It's going to be quite a short talk, and it will be followed up by another talk on the male reproductive system. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the topics I'm going to cover are going to be the anatomy of the female reproductive system, oogenesis, that's the formation of the egg, the ova, the menstrual cycle, fertilization and implantation, and then I will thank you and show you some references. So first of all, anatomy of the female reproductive system. So the essential differences between the male and female. In males, testosterone secretion is constant and spermatogenesis is continuous from puberty. That means the formation of sperm occurs constantly from puberty until death in most men. In females, ovulation and release of the ova is periodic and hormonal secretion displays cyclical swings once a month. The tissues affected by female hormones undergo cyclic changes, e.g. monthly menstrual cycle. The cycle repeats if fertilization does not occur. The cycles are interrupted, well, they become interrupted if fertilization is successful and the system changes function to regulate implantation, fetal development, and pregnancy. Maternal function continues postpartum with milk production, lactation, and suckling of the neonate, the child. Here is the anatomy of the female reproductive system. I'm not going to go through every single one of those. This is for you to just take a look at and get a general feel for. The important structures for female reproduction are obviously the ovaries and the oviduct, known as the fallopian tube that connects the ovary to the uterus. So the egg can be fertilized, move into the uterus and implant. Also important are the cervix, the entranceway into the uterus, and the vagina, the entranceway into the cervix. So these structures are very important for female reproduction, but there's some other structures there too. For example, we have the clitoris, which is essential for enjoyment of sex by the female. Okay, so moving on. The ovaries, oviducts, and uterus. Now, this is a sort of stylized image of these structures. The structures themselves are usually bent around a little bit more than that. The important things in this image are the ovaries themselves, the oviduct or fallopian tube. This allows the transport of the egg down into the uterus. The uterus has a lining known as the endometrium, which allows the egg to implant when it's fertilized. Around that, we have the myometrium. This is the smooth muscle, the layer of smooth muscle that surrounds the uterus and allows it to contract. Cervix and vagina, I've already talked about. Now, the ovaries come in pairs, as do the oviducts. So the ovaries are held at the mouths of the oviducts by ligaments. The uterus has two functional layers: the outer myometrium of smooth muscle, the inner endometrium, a mucous and vascular layer which changes in thickness and structure with the menstrual cycle. Gets thicker basically when the hormone progesterone is produced by a structure called the corpus luteum after ovulation. I will get to that later. If no fertilization occurs, the endometrium becomes detached and is shed. This is known as menstruation. So the ovaries' main female reproductive organs come in pairs at the site of oogenesis, the production of eggs. They synthesize and secrete the main reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which are both steroids. Steroid hormones are basically hormones that are made from cholesterol. One of the reasons we need cholesterol in our diets. Blood vessels, nerves, lymph vessels enter through the mesothelium. Part of the ovary. There's a dense outer cortex known as a stroma and a loose inner medulla. Throughout the cortex are the follicles. Each follicle contains what we call a primary oocyte. So an underdeveloped egg that later develops and is released during ovulation. Oogenesis itself. So here we have the sequence of oogenesis. Now, I've mentioned before, but for anyone that hasn't seen previous talks, we have 46 chromosomes in our normal somatic cells, 2 pairs of 23, 2 pairs of 23. Now, when we produce an egg or a sperm, we have half of that number. So we go down to 23 rather than 46, just one set of each chromosome. As a result of that, that reduction, we end up in a situation known as haploid rather than diploid. Diploid means a pair of each chromosome, 46 chromosomes. Haploid means just one of each. So when we produce an egg or a sperm, we become haploid. Now, when it comes to oogenesis, the formation of eggs, the first stage of this is when the oogonium divides. The oogonium at the top there is basically a type of stem cell, a mother cell. It can divide and give rise to more specialized cells, in this case, a primary and then secondary oocytes. So the oogonium itself starts with 46 chromosomes. It divides. There's a series of divisions, and you end up with the primary oocytes, which also have 46 chromosomes. Then there's an enlargement, a further change in the structure of each of these primary oocytes. And then what happens is a secondary oocyte is formed. The secondary oocyte has only 23. So we basically have 23 chromosomes at this point. And then the secondary oocyte matures. We get a mature egg, which may or may not fuse with a sperm. So oogenesis, development of the ovum. In human females, meiosis begins in all oogonia, the egg mother cells in the developing ovaries. Meiosis is that process where you begin to go down from your 46 to your 23 chromosomes. So this is during late prenatal life, but it gets arrested at prophase 1. So basically, what this is saying is that all of the eggs that a female produces, they start the development when she is still a fetus in her mother's womb, which makes for quite an interesting thought. It basically means that every single person watching this talk right now, they were present in their grandmother's body. They were present, or at least part of you was present in your grandmother's body, because you, at least half of you, came from an egg, the other half from the sperm. And that egg formed in your mother's ovary when your mother was in your grandmother's womb. So you're present in your grandmother's womb, kind of like Chinese dolls. Okay, so baby girls are born with about 2 million primary oocytes, all of which are in a sort of state of suspended development. They started developing when she was fetus, and then they stopped. Oocyte development is sequentially reactivated at puberty and at each menstrual cycle thereafter, as the young female acquires full reproductive capacity. Most of these primordial follicles degenerate, so by puberty, about 300 to 400,000 are left, more than a woman needs for a lifetime. This is the ovary of a 2-year-old girl. And what you're seeing here, these little round structures are the primordial follicles, the follicles that will produce a mature egg, which is then released into the oviduct, the fallopian tube, for fertilization. And this is a sort of stylized image of an ovary. You can see the primary follicles. There's a structure in the middle known as the zona pellucida. There's the secondary follicles. They then develop an antrum. Basically, what you're seeing here is you're seeing an egg develop as it moves through the ovary. You end up with this Graafian follicle. Eventually, you get the follicle growing and popping, releasing the egg. So, 2N, that means 2 sets of chromosomes, primary oocyte. As puberty approaches, each primary oocyte increases in size as it produces ribosomes. Ribosomes are the organelles in the cells that make proteins. Cells need proteins, bodies need proteins. RNA, other cellular organelles also accumulate. Basically, the cell, this egg, as it grows, it needs enough food, enough energy within it to survive until a placenta is produced. When the egg is released, it will become fertilized, or if it becomes fertilized by a sperm, it will then have to migrate all the way to the uterus where it will implant. And it's only once it's implanted and produced a placenta to connect it to the mother that the egg will be able to get energy from the mother. Until that point, as the cells in the egg are growing and dividing, all the energy needs to already be present in that egg. It can't obtain any new energy supplies until the placenta forms and the egg attached, and that takes quite a few days. So the egg needs to accumulate all these organelles, these proteins, RNA, and other things. The primary oocytes are surrounded by a layer of flat granulosa cells and comprise the primordial follicle. Following puberty, a number of primary oocytes are activated at the beginning of each menstrual cycle and complete meiosis 1. This is the journey towards full development of an egg, and becomes the secondary oocyte. Now it has N number of chromosomes. It's gone from 2N to N, so 46 chromosomes to 23. And one of those will be a sex chromosome. And in an egg, that will always be an X. The sperm could be an X or a Y, because men have an X and a Y chromosome. But in the female, so one of these chromosomes will always be an X, there will not be a Y. The menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle and ovulation. At the beginning of each menstrual cycle, day 1, one or more primary follicles containing a primary oocyte is activated and recommences development. The follicle develops several layers and a large central space known as an antrum, and the primary oocyte divides to become the secondary oocyte. This is the first meiotic division. On day 14 of the cycle, a surge in hormonal activity triggers the release of the secondary oocyte from the mature Graafian follicle. This is known as ovulation. The first phase of the menstrual cycle is known as the follicular phase. It's days 1 to 14. The phase ends with ovulation. This is all controlled by a hormone known as FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. So the brain contains an endocrine gland called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces something called gonadotrophin releasing hormone, gonadotrophin releasing hormone. And gonadotrophin releasing hormone controls the release by the pituitary gland of FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. So FH is released, FSH, sorry, follicular stimulating hormone. And as it's released, it stimulates the development of the follicle. The follicle grows and grows. So an individual follicle, sometimes more than one, will start to then develop and grow on the ovary. As this follicle grows, the egg inside matures and the follicle itself begins releasing estrogen. The follicle grows and grows and grows under the control of FSH, and more estrogen is produced until eventually you get to a certain point where you have a very high level of estrogen being produced. Once you reach a certain level of estrogen, this causes a surge in the release by the pituitary gland of luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. This causes the follicle to pop and ovulation to occur. During this production of estrogen, there's also a slight thickening of the endometrial lining, the lining of tissue in the uterus, to start preparing for the implantation of an egg. Then we have the second phase of the menstrual cycle, known as the luteal phase. This is day 15 to day 28. Following ovulation, the remains of the follicle become the corpus luteum. So the egg has been released, and there is just the remains of a follicle. This follicle, the remains of a follicle, becomes a gland called the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone and estrogen. At this point, FSH and LH are low. They are low. The progesterone basically prevents the further production of the FSH. So you don't get a second follicle growing while there's a potential for fertilization to occur. So the progesterone released by the corpus luteum prevents another egg from being released. As a sort of side note, progesterone and derivatives of it can be used as a contraceptive pill, basically to prevent ovulation. Okay, so the endometrium increasingly becomes thick and more vascular, gets more of a blood supply under the control of progesterone being released by the corpus luteum. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, the progesterone and estrogen levels will decline because the corpus luteum starts shrinking from the moment it's formed, degenerates, and gets smaller and smaller until eventually it's not producing progesterone and estrogen anymore. And because it's not producing progesterone, once it's started to deteriorate, eventually the progesterone levels will be so low that it's no longer able to maintain a thick endometrium. So the endometrium is shed, and this is menstruation. So moving on to fertilization and implantation. So first, back to that corpus luteum. After ovulation, the follicle becomes the corpus luteum. Remaining cells become glandular, secrete progesterone and estrogen in preparation for pregnancy. The corpus luteum degenerates after about 10 to 12 days if no pregnancy occurs. The important hormones, just to summarize here, we have estrogen and we have progesterone. And here's just a summary of their functions. I won't go through them again. Just maybe take a look at this slide yourself in your own time. Fertilization. Now, fertilization occurs in a structure known as the ampulla, which is, well, usually occurs in the ampulla, which is a sort of bent part of the fallopian tube, the oviduct. So sperm cells are transported through the cervix, the uterus, and oviduct to the ampulla. During transportations, the spermatozoa undergo something called capacitation. This facilitates release of enzymes which enable the penetration of the cervical mucosa, meaning the sperm can penetrate the egg and deposit its nucleus within the egg so that the egg can become fertilized and you go from 23 chromosomes back to 46, and an egg can then develop into a fetus. I should say that sometimes the egg does not get fertilized in the ampulla. It gets fertilized in the ampulla. It can be fertilized in another part here. But what can happen sometimes, what should happen is if the egg is fertilized, it moves along, develops into something called a morula, then a blastocyst as the cells within it divide. And then by the time it gets to the uterus, it can then produce a placenta, attach to the endometrium of the uterus. But sometimes there can be a mistake, and the fertilized egg can attach to the fallopian tube rather than the uterus. This is known as an ectopic pregnancy. If the egg attaches anywhere other than in the uterus, it's an ectopic pregnancy, and it's not viable. You may feel you're pregnant when you have an ectopic pregnancy. The hormones will change, all of that kind of thing. However, if an ectopic pregnancy occurs, it will fail because the lining of structures such as the fallopian tubes are not thick enough to support a developing baby. So it will eventually tear loose and cause a hemorrhage. And this can be very dangerous. Women can actually die from internal bleeding because of this. Okay, so moving on. Fertilization and implantation 1. The sperm is viable for up to 72 hours. The most fertile phase is the first 24 hours. Fertilization occurs in the oviduct, the fallopian tube. Fertilized ovum becomes the diploid zygote 2N and is transported along the oviduct to the uterus. The zygote will attach to the endometrium and will implant 7 to 9 days after fertilization. Occasionally, the zygote will implant in the wall of the oviduct, which leads to an ectopic pregnancy, as previously discussed. Fertilization and implantation 2. During fertilization, the secondary oocyte briefly becomes the ovum, second meiotic division, and then the zygote, 2N, full set of chromosomes, which travels down the oviduct and implants in the uterine wall. The remains of the follicle, the corpus luteum, take on a controlling role by releasing progesterone at this point. Further mitotic divisions, so cells just dividing in 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, so 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc., lead to embryogenesis and fetal development. The placenta develops as an interface between the mother and the fetus, providing nourishment and eliminating waste. Now, you might wonder why the baby isn't released when the endometrium starts to degenerate due to the degeneration of the corpus luteum, the less production of progesterone. So why does menstruation not result in the loss of the baby? The reason is, when the placenta forms, it actually starts producing its own progesterone, which stops further ovulation and also stops menstruation, so it prevents the lining of the endometrium from being shed. So the menstrual cycle kind of halts for the duration of pregnancy as a placenta produces progesterone. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been informative. Here we have a few references for you if you want to read a bit more about these topics yourself. And obviously, do not forget that you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @MarkOfTheD.